Here's a challenge. Survive one shift inside a medieval forge. First, you're working in suffocating smoke. Then comes the hammering, endless strikes that break your shoulders faster than iron breaks on the anvil. You can't complain because fatigue is a weakness, and weakness isn't tolerated. By the time you're done, you'll see why they say this job aged men before they became masters. The real question is, could you make it to sundown, or would the forge break you entirely? Imagine being 6 years old and walking into a world where your childhood ends before it even begins. That was the reality for many who became blacksmiths. There was no classroom, no choice, and no question about whether you were ready. You entered the forge not with dreams of the future, but because someone told you this was where your life would now belong. You weren't an apprentice in the way we picture today, learning gently under a master's careful hand. You were an extra body put to work before you even had the strength to lift the tools you were expected to one day command. The first lesson wasn't how to shape iron, it was how to obey, how to survive in smoke and fire without complaint. For a blacksmith's apprentice, childhood was less about discovery and more about endurance. You were expected to carry loads your body wasn't yet fitted for. Tasks given to a small boy were not scaled down in kindness, but rather piled on with the intent of forcing growth through hardship. Imagine trying to balance a bar of iron longer than your body, struggling not to let it fall while the men around you berated your clumsy movements. Stoking a fire was not as simple as adding sticks to a flame. Coal had to be shoveled, bellows had to be climbed, pulled and pumped, and each motion came with the demand of immediacy. The forge did not wait for childhood strength. It pushed children into painful imitation of men's labor. Each day hammered a boy into something harder than flesh, or broke him in the attempt. The rhythm of the forge did not even end when work was over, because for many apprentices there was no after. These boys often slept where they worked, lying on rough planks in the same room where sparks had flown all day, where soot coated every beam, and where the acrid odor of burned coal lingered without mercy. The forge itself was their nursery and prison. There was no silence except in broken intervals, no escape from the ringing echo of the anvil that lingered in the skull like a second heartbeat. If they were lucky, they got bread and scraps for dinner, and if they were unlucky, the work continued into the evening, proving that rest was not guaranteed, but earned through exhaustion. Childhood laughter was replaced by the hiss of iron quenching in water. To the outside world, a blacksmith apprentice was being trained. Inside the forge, he was being reshaped into a body that lived for one thing: labor. Unlike other trades where skill was nurtured step by step, the forge brutalized its pupils into learning. A carpenter's son might begin by sanding wood or fitting pegs, gradually working upward with patience and skill. A young smith, in contrast, was forced to repeat the most punishing tasks endlessly, learning mostly through repetition and the constant fear of failure. Strike incorrectly, and you might cause the iron to crack. Move too slowly, and the master's hand might reach for you faster than the cooling metal. Mistakes weren't just corrected, they were branded into memory by punishment or humiliation. Skill came, but not from the steady encouragement of progress. It emerged out of pain, fear, and familiarity with suffering. It wasn't a ladder up, but a treadmill that never stopped moving. The worst part was not just the weight of the iron or the flames licking too close to young skin. The deepest weight pressed on the mind. Imagine knowing even at 10 years old that this was your only path. If you walked away from training, where would you go? There was no safety net, no schoolhouse to return to, no second chance awaiting elsewhere. Stopping meant hunger. Stopping meant you would carry no skill, no means of survival. Apprenticeship was not one step toward freedom, it was the entire chain. From the moment you were old enough to enter the forge, your life path was dictated. In many cases, the only way out of the forge was through death or crippling injury, neither of which were unlikely. The hammer was a tool for work, but it was also a symbol of the lock on your existence. Children who refused or faltered were not viewed as fragile, but as failures. There was little sympathy for a crying boy whose hand was blistered from hauling coal. Tears had no value in a system where the fire never dimmed and villagers' needs never stopped. Fueling the forge was more important than protecting a child's health, and that truth shaped every apprentice. Their strongest survival lesson was not metalwork itself, but obedience and the ability to ignore their own pain. Eventually, those boys carrying bars too heavy for them stopped complaining because complaints made no difference. Instead, their backs bent earlier, their hands hardened faster, and the difference between youth and adulthood blurred into nothing. Even sleep offered no real break, because the forge followed them into dreams. The roar of the bellows and the clanging of hammers became sounds that lived inside their ears. The air itself, filled with smoke, soot, and grit, stained their skin and lungs from the beginning. Boys often woke coughing, their throats raw, only to rise and face the same fire again. Childhood illnesses were often brushed aside as weakness, yet every cough hinted at futures that would leave men gasping for air decades before they should. Every early burn scar was a reminder that pain was just a rule of existence. By the time an apprentice reached his early teens, his body already carried the story of his life in ash, smoke, and scars. And yet, no matter how much they grew, the harshness of the job did not retreat. Age did not lighten the burden so much as it shifted it. The small boy who once struggled with iron bars became the teenager who swung the hammer, each strike carving strength into muscle, but also pulling time forward, rushing both growth and decay. The promise of things getting easier never truly arrived. Instead, with each passing year, the weight only grew heavier, the hammer larger, the responsibility fiercer. One could not grow into the forge, one only became more tightly woven into it. So apprenticeship wasn't a short chapter before a freer adulthood. It was life itself. It was not a beginning, but a permanent state. Children were not being prepared for a better future, but pared down to fit the shape of endless labor. They weren't simply learning a trade, they were becoming part of the fire. They entered as boys, but the forge consumed everything that made them children. And should they survive long enough to be called masters, the physical price waiting for them was even greater. The body did not leave the forge untouched. It carried the fire into every joint and breath. Childhood was only the first sacrifice. If those boys endured, the years ahead would grind them down even sharper. What does it cost to work a lifetime in smoke and fire? The answer is everything. The forge was not a workplace a man could walk into lightly, nor walk out of unchanged. The moment he stepped through the doors of that world, the heat wrapped around him like a grip that never let go. His skin felt it first, but his bones, lungs, and sinews would follow in time. Every hammer he struck pulled a little more from him, and in the end there was nothing left the fire had not already claimed. The heat in a medieval forge was not like standing beside a warm hearth. It was more like standing inside the open mouth of a furnace, where iron bent to human will only because the human body tolerated misery long enough to shape it. The fires burned at temperatures that left the skin prickling even from several strides away. Stand too close, and the hair on your arms curled into ash. Sparks jumped constantly, not as isolated accidents, but as a daily storm leaping without warning and branding the body in small, sharp moments. There was no safe corner, no shaded distance. The forge radiated its punishment in every direction. The smoke added a second layer to the torment. Thick, rolling, and heavy with coal, it filled every breath with grit. Every inhale dragged soot down into the chest, sticking to the inside of the lungs like residue in a chimney. Men didn't speak of this openly, but they all recognized the tightness that lingered in their breathing after long days. It was like swallowing a fog that never lifted. By the end of the shift, the smell of scorched iron clung to his clothes and hair so deeply that no amount of washing could erase it. Even beyond the forge, the air inside his body was still thick with smoke. But the air and heat alone weren't what made the forge devastating. The real punishment lived inside the endless repetition. To shape iron was to repeat the same motions thousands of times, not once or twice. The smith swung his hammer against the red-hot metal over and over until each strike sunk into his body as deeply as it sank into iron. The shoulders wore down faster than the calendar, and the tendons in his arms felt older than his years. When he rested, the joints didn't quiet, they throbbed, reminding him the forge never stopped even when his hammer did. Burns weren't tragic incidents, they were daily features of the life. If a spark landed and hissed against the skin, there was no ceremony. He shook it off, maybe pressed the mark with ash, and continued. Fingers blistered, wrists bore pink scars, and arms hardened with a patchwork of burns overlapping like maps of forgotten injuries. Over time, they stopped being noticed. The skin itself became a crude record of time served. Hands were perpetually coarse and cracked, fingers twisted in odd ways from both the heat and the endless weight of the hammer. The blacksmith's body became as much a tool as the anvils themselves, marked and worn in the same brutal fashion. Heavy loads shaped men as much as fire ever did. Iron bars, horseshoes, tools, none of them were light or simple. They were lifted and carried day after day. The back bowed, not from choice but from having the spine forced into submission. Many men walked through their villages bent long before age had any right to claim them. It wasn't old age that made them hunch, but the accumulation of burdens carried too often. And unlike a field laborer whose toil might change with the seasons, the blacksmith's load never eased. Metal did not grow lighter with time. From the outside, villagers often saw only strength. They saw a man capable of taming fire, raising a hammer, bending unyielding iron into useful shapes. To them, the smith was a figure of durability, a worker who seemed tougher than the average farmer or herder. But that image was a mask. Inside, every tendon frayed more quickly than it should. Every breath came shorter, and every bone bore the memory of injuries long forgotten by those outside the forge. What looked like power was often just resilience stretched to breaking. The rhythm of the forge deepened this illusion. The hammer rose and fell in predictable beats, forming a ritual so hypnotic it seemed like strength itself. But those repetitions didn't build strength forever. They eroded the body like water wears down stone. Imagine swinging that hammer hundreds upon hundreds of times across a single day, then repeating it tomorrow and the day after for decades without rest. The sound of iron clashing echoed outward to the village, but the true echo was inside a man's bones, where the rhythm etched itself into pain that never entirely faded. His very heartbeat began to feel like it was keeping time with the hammer, a rhythm from which he could never escape. And the question remains, how did they manage to sustain this life? How did men keep breathing when the very air they lived in was an enemy? Perhaps they didn't, not fully. Many grew old before their time, shoulders frozen, lungs weakened, skin so scarred it seemed built not of flesh but of leather and coal. The forge wasn't only hot on the outside, it gnawed at them from within, shrinking lifespans and accelerating decay. Survival meant carrying forward through damage rather than avoiding it. A blacksmith gave the fire more than metal. He gave it skin, lung, joint, and breath. He became not just a worker, but a living tool, sharpened and dulled at once, eventually breaking apart like any other object in his shop. His prime was often spent not in strength, but in decline, hidden beneath displays of labor. Society gained its plows, its weapons, its hinges, but the man behind them lost himself slowly, consumed by the very craft that defined him. And so the body of the smith was ground down as surely as the iron sparks that cracked into dust across the floor. He served as the hammer served, useful, vital, but inevitably breaking far before its time. And yet, with his body hollowed out and his breath weakened, the work continued. His degradation was not considered tragedy, but simply a cost of living, absorbed into a system that survived because he endured more than he should have. In the end, every scar, every shortened breath, every bend in the frame of his body was proof that he had been consumed by a fire no water could quench. He was not the master of the forge, he was its fuel, and still those broken bodies sustained entire communities, hammering out the pieces of everyday life, even while no one stopped to thank them. Every breath was another gamble with death. Standing in a medieval forge meant breathing in more than just air. It meant swallowing coal dust, smoke, and tiny shards of metal that floated unseen but entered the lungs with every draw. From the very first day an apprentice stepped into that smoky space, his body began absorbing poisons that would never leave. Unlike burns, which scarred the skin where everyone could see them, the forge's most dangerous punishment was hidden inside, biding its time until it surfaced years later. The blacksmith had no shield against it, no cloth over the mouth, no ventilation systems pulling smoke away, no special windows engineered for airflow. All he had was bare lungs, forced to inhale the haze that clung low to the ground and drifted with the bellows' rhythm. Each time the fire roared brighter, clouds of soot surged upward, then spread through the room, heavy and unrelenting. There was no escaping its reach. For hours on end, coal smoke filled the body like water filling a jar, saturating every breath. Imagine standing in a chamber where sparks flew freely, disappearing the moment they kissed the skin, but leaving traces where eyes could not follow. Small particles floated into the mouth, tiny fragments of ash and metal, invisible to sight but thick enough to taste. It wasn't just smoke. It was matter reduced to powder, drawn deep into the chest where lungs strained with every rise and fall. Clothing caught some of it, skin caught more, pores darkened until the very sweat rolling down arms carried shadow with it. The damage it caused crept slowly. Coughs were constant companions, ignored not because they were harmless, but because there was no remedy. A deep rattle in the chest was blamed on weakness. Breathlessness was dismissed as laziness. The smith knew his body weakened, but the labor required strong lungs to pull the bellows, to fuel flames hot enough to make iron pliable. Without that strength, the hammer grew heavier, the fire quicker to wane. Each task demanded more air, yet the forge gave back only smoke. By the time a man admitted he could not breathe properly, the destruction was already fixed inside him. Diseases had names we use today, bronchitis, asthma, black lung, but in the medieval world, those words did not exist. What existed was the reality of narrowing airways, of lungs filling harder with each day, of nights spent coughing until the chest heaved and eyes watered. There were men who thought themselves cursed, believing evil spirits clung to their lungs. Others simply assumed they had aged too quickly. The truth was simpler and crueler. Their own craft was suffocating them long before time naturally would. The forge's air did not strike all at once like a sudden injury. It stole capacity piece by piece. Years of exposure hollowed chests that once expanded fully until even walking across the room felt like climbing a hill. A smith might once have hammered continuously for hours, but later found himself pausing with the excuse of wiping sweat, unable to admit the pauses were for air. His apprentices might look on, mistaking fatigue for seniority, when in truth, every breath had become a battle. There is a cruel irony in how vital breath was for the very tasks that caused its destruction. Bellows required not just arms but lungs. The rhythm of pulling and pressing demanded as much stamina as hammering. To work the forge meant amplifying fire, yet that act deepened the smoke's assault. The hotter the blaze, the sicker the body became. It was a vicious cycle where success as a blacksmith hastened failure as a man. Even young boys felt the sting in their lungs. Apprentices coughed alongside their masters, though theirs was often laughed off as weakness to be overcome. But exposure at such an early age planted disease deep within. By their 20s, many already struggled with stamina. Their shoulders could swing the hammer, but their lungs strained to keep pace. Some grew dependent on apprentices of their own earlier than tradition dictated because they physically could not continue the work. The forge aged them not only on the outside, but also in the lungs, where every ounce of ash remained. The smell inside a forge was not the smell of simple firewood. It was harsher, bitter, laced with chemicals born from burning coal and iron. Once inhaled, it lingered on the tongue like charred bitterness. The body knew it was poison long before medicine could define why. Even outside the forge, the odor followed men around, clinging so deeply that families knew immediately when a smith entered a home. It was not only on his clothes, but moving through his breath, leaking outward with every word he spoke. The blackened pores on arms and face revealed how much of it had been trapped under skin. If the outside looked that marked, imagine what the inside had endured. Coughing fits plagued daily life. They came without warning, striking in the middle of hammer strokes or while carrying heavy loads. A smith might double over, coughing into his arm, then return immediately to work as if nothing had happened. There was no space to stop, no sympathy offered. Villages needed repairs, weapons, tools, and waiting meant loss. Work demanded completion regardless of whether the man himself had the breath left to give it. His sickness didn't just weaken him, it became invisible to others, accepted as just another part of his occupation. The tragedy is clear. The forge did not need combat to strike down its workers. It didn't rely on fire accidents, collapsing structures, or misswung hammers to destroy a man. It killed silently, grain by grain, with every inhalation. The very air became the greatest enemy. Without lungs strong enough to draw breath, the forge's daily rituals were impossible. And yet those rituals were the only means of survival, not for the smith alone, but for everyone relying on his labor. He gasped, but he kept working. By middle age, when other men of the village still worked farmland with years ahead, many smiths were struggling. Age bent them earlier, but not only from carrying. It bent them because lungs no longer fully expanded, because nights filled with coughing robbed them of rest, because the fire scarred them invisibly. Their bodies were not finished by natural time. They were hollowed out by exposure. In the forge, skin bore scars easily seen, but lungs bore scars without number, hidden until breath itself faltered. That is the cruel secret. The forge scarred the inside more harshly than the outside. A man could still look broad-shouldered, still appear intimidating at work, but inside he struggled with each inhalation. The collapse did not always come suddenly, but it did come consistently. By the middle years of life, he was often chasing air he could never fully draw. And yet, even with bodies breaking from the inside out, blacksmiths were never without demand. Tools had to be mended, weapons forged, hinges shaped, and plowshares sharpened. Without them, normal life ground to a halt. So, despite the smoke filling their lungs and bringing them closer to suffocation, they continued. Society leaned on their endurance, blind to the damage, because a world without blacksmiths could not function. Essential to everyone, but valued by no one. That was the reality of being a blacksmith in the Middle Ages. The paradox is almost hard to imagine today. Every villager relied on the smith for everyday survival. Yet when it came to recognition or reward, he was often treated as if his work was the least distinguished of all. Without him, fields would not be plowed, swords would not be sharpened, and wagons would not roll. Still, he occupied the shadows of the social ladder, living in a space where necessity did not bring esteem. His forge was indispensable, but the man behind it was overlooked. The rhythm of village life flowed through his anvil, yet payment rarely reflected that importance. Instead of coin, a smith might be handed whatever his customer had to spare that week. A chicken with missing feathers, a basket of barley that had already gone a bit stale, or even vague promises that payment will come after the harvest. Some repaid their debts, many did not. The blacksmith's livelihood was precarious because the needs of the community were endless, but their gratitude was thin. He might sharpen plowshares that kept entire families fed, yet in return receive an animal already too sick to survive the season. For him, trade was not an equal exchange. It was a reminder of how little dignity his labor was afforded. Worse still was the inconsistency of it all. The same villagers who left him waiting for repayment would appear at his forge with an urgent request the very next week, acting as though his time was theirs by right. They needed shoes for a horse before a long journey. They needed nails, hinges, locks, things that couldn't wait. And so the smith answered, because refusing meant gaining the village's anger, a dangerous prospect for any man who lived at the crossroads of community survival. He knew his skill was necessary, but he also knew that necessity did not guarantee respect. Each clang of his hammer made that truth clearer. Wars shifted the balance, but not in his favor. When armies needed weapons, the village smith was suddenly in demand beyond anything ordinary life required. Blades, arrowheads, armor rivets. Orders came faster than he could fill them. The forge blazed through the night as the hammers sang without rest. It might sound like opportunity, but for the smith, it was more often exhaustion. He worked like a machine, producing tools for killing, driven not by choice but by expectation. Villagers, lords, or recruiters treated him less as a craftsman and more as part of the engine of war. The payment during such times still rarely matched the toll it took. And when peace returned, so too did the cycle of neglect. That pendulum swing carried its own cruelty. When battle quieted, demand for weapons slowed, and orders for farming tools or household repairs could not match the frantic pace he had just endured. Yet people still came knocking, with far less to offer. Suddenly the man who had been pressed to supply hundreds of arrowheads found himself bargaining over a cracked kettle. His hands bore the scars of battles fought in his forge, but his pockets bore little from the effort. The lull between wars, while calmer in sound, was not restful in reality. It hollowed men with uncertainty. A day could bring no work at all, or it could bring work so poorly compensated that it barely kept his family alive. Social perception reinforced this precarious place. The blacksmith provided essential tools, yet his rank did not rise accordingly. Men bowed their heads before clergy, admired knights for their valor, or envied merchants for their coin and travel. The smith received none of that reverence. He sweat in shadows, tied to ash and fire, a figure respected only at the door of need. If he walked through the market, villagers recognized his face, but not with admiration. He wasn't seen as part of prestige or power, but merely as one more laborer. Even when his hands had made the very sword a knight wore proudly, the honor swelled to the knight, not to the one who had wrought the steel. That lack of status carried into the fabric of daily interaction. Imagine crafting a plow so a farmer's livelihood could continue, only to receive a sack of grain worth half the sweat poured into forging the blades. The grain might not even be clean, perhaps littered with husks and stones, forcing his family to spend hours separating food from waste. Coins circulated elsewhere, but to the smith it arrived only in fragments. A noble might commission larger work occasionally, paying something closer to fair wages. Yet those rare jobs only underscored how little common transactions brought. His forge was always hot, always ringing, but his table often bare. The irony was crushing. He was more universal than the knight, the merchant, or even the priest. Farmers, soldiers, and lords alike all depended on him. Each person's tools, weapons, or household needs passed through his hands. Without him, society's structure weakened, and yet, despite this universal reliance, he remained treated as a backup figure, a man forgotten unless someone's cart broke or horse needed shoeing. The hammer struck loudly, but the man holding it was invisible. In this sense, he was less a craftsman celebrated for his mastery and more like a village handyman, summoned at need, dismissed in between, his worth tied only to the urgency of others. When the forge roared, people remembered him. When its sound fell silent, they did not. That silence reveals another truth. The blacksmith could not demand value equal to his contribution, because to most villagers, his absence only mattered in crisis. They noticed the lack of nails when doors fell, the lack of horseshoes when journeys slowed, the lack of arrowheads when disputes flared into conflict. In all other moments, the smith melted back into the background, carrying his soot-stained anonymity as heavily as the metal he worked. This was the harsh cycle, relied upon, overlooked, needed urgently, then forgotten. It left him in a condition that was not poverty exactly, nor prestige, something in between, unstable and uncelebrated. The forge survived through barter and uneven payments. The man survived through endurance alone. He was the heartbeat of the village, but one that drew little notice until it faltered. And when that heartbeat stopped, its absence revealed just how fragile everything around it truly was. Because what happened when no one heard the anvils ringing anymore? What happened when the village's smith finally broke under the weight of his own work? It was then that the cracks in society began to show, wide and undeniable. What happens to a village if the smith simply dies? The question might sound simple, yet for communities in the Middle Ages, the answer carried the weight of survival itself. The forge was not one trade among many. It was the hub through which every aspect of daily life passed. From the farmer pushing his plough into the soil, to the carter hauling goods down muddy roads, to the soldier arming himself with steel. Each depended on the rhythm of one hammer striking one anvil. If that sound ceased, the machinery of the village weakened at once. It was not only the loss of a man, but the collapse of the system he sustained. Every artifact of existence bore his mark. Farmers brought shares for sharpening, carriages needed new wheels bound with iron hoops, and the very nails that fastened doors together came from his fire. One individual kept the tools alive. Remove him, and the plough soon snapped with no way to repair it. The wagon stood lamed when its wheel cracked, and hinges rusted until doors hung loose. In castles or large towns where multiple smiths might labor side by side, one death could be absorbed. But in a village of only 50 or 60 families, he alone was the foundation. His absence split daily life at the seams, leaving jobs half completed and lives scrambling for solutions not readily found. Replacement was never quick. A blacksmith did not appear overnight, forged from the same fire he had once managed. To reach the level where he could reliably craft and repair meant years upon years of apprenticeship. Children had to begin this training before they could truly understand it, spending their youth in fire and ash, and only decades later were they able to stand independently as masters of the craft. If a smith died without a grown son to inherit the work, villages were forced into desperate choices. They could hire outsiders if coin or trade allowed. Sometimes that meant sending for a traveling smith whose loyalty stretched only as long as the wages flowed. Other times they adapted with makeshift substitutes, patching tools with wood, binding brakes with rope, or abandoning them completely. None lasted long. Imagine a harvest season when the anvil fell quiet. The farmer's blade dulled quickly, dragging instead of cutting, wasting precious days and strength. The cart's damaged wheels slowed trade until goods spoiled in storage. Even the church bell, cracked in its tower, could not be repaired without a skilled hand to pour new metal. Each ignored repair multiplied into disaster, widening into hunger, disrepair, and quarrels over resources. Without metal to hold life together, villages teetered on collapse. In this way, civilization itself balanced dangerously on the endurance of one man's body. His strength or frailty echoed across an entire community, holding them together or leaving them to falter in his absence. The smith's bloodline became less a family and more a form of infrastructure. Sons were often bound to the hammer, not through choice of passion, but through the heavy expectations of necessity. To abandon the forge meant not only leaving behind a trade, but leaving behind the survival of neighbors and kin. A boy who wished to take up farming or join a monastery or pursue another trade carried the weight of guilt that came with refusing the hammer. Villagers saw inheritance less as a right than as an obligation. If the father could not rise, then the son must, whether he was willing or not. This passing on of the role gave villages fragile continuity. A teenage boy, scarcely through his own apprenticeship, might suddenly find himself expected to fill the place of a seasoned man. His shoulders had not grown into the hammer's demand, his lungs still raw from the forge's smoke, yet villagers pressed him into full responsibility. Orders piled up faster than his ability could manage. Mistakes were inevitable. Tools broke under inexperience, but the work continued. The forge did not stop for grief or youth. It demanded endurance beyond reason. The strain sometimes bent apprentices until they themselves broke. Boys handled tasks far heavier than their strength could bear. Their bodies pushed years ahead into labor they were not ready to sustain. Burns, crushed fingers, and broken joints became almost a rite of passage. In those years where they stood between childhood and mastery, the line between success and collapse was agonizingly thin. Entire villages held their breath on whether the boy could last long enough to grow into the man they needed him to be. The scarcity of smiths only deepened the fragility. In larger towns, guilds offered structure and means of training replacements. In isolated hamlets, those safeguards did not exist. When their smith was gone, they sent petitions to distant settlements or lords to provide replacements, but responses came slow or not at all. Journeys to hire traveling smiths were costly, dangerous, and uncertain. Some communities uprooted entirely, forced to migrate toward places where ironwork might be found again. Lives anchored in soil and stone were uprooted by the silence of one anvil. This silence was not just absence, it was grief sharpened by necessity. The forge had anchored the heartbeat of the place. Its dull roar filled spaces much larger than its smoky walls. Villagers gathered there to barter, whisper news, or hear gossip between the clang of hammer blows. It was more than fire and metal, it was social architecture. When the hammer stopped, an entire way of life fractured. Without repairs, without weapons, without hinges or nails, everything else strained to continue. The smith's death drew a line clear enough for everyone to see, the edge where labor sustained them or left them adrift. At times, villages took drastic measures to keep the forge alive. Younger apprentices were forced into mastery far before their years, standing at the anvil with hands blistered against tools too heavy for them. Widow wives sometimes held authority over apprentices in the brief years before sons could assume their place, managing accounts and exchanges, while others handled the fire. Whatever the form, the continuity mattered more than accuracy, because without it, existence itself threatened to unravel. What do we learn by looking at that fragility? The truth is stark. The forge was not only a place where iron was shaped, it was a point of continuity binding generations together. The work sustained not just a family, but the community's very ability to function. Every plow and hinge whispered of survival. Every horseshoe carried the possibility of journeys unhindered. The forge linked yesterday to tomorrow. When it broke, when its keeper fell, society stumbled, struggling for any foothold, until the sound of hammer and anvil returned once more. And still a question lingers. If the body could break so easily and the system leaned so heavily on one pair of hands, how did these men sustain themselves in the face of endless labor? Not with their muscles alone, but with their minds, which learned, in fire and isolation, to endure what seemed unbearable. Decades of hammering the same strokes, how did they keep from going mad? The forge was a place where the body endured scars and wounds, but the mind carried its own struggles. Every day looked like the one before it. The same dull glow of the embers, the same heavy clinking of metal against anvil, the same black stains that clung to skin. Without a way to place meaning in the endless repetition, despair could have swallowed a blacksmith whole. But instead of collapsing under it, many learned to treat the monotony as a rhythm, a drum beat that gave structure when the world around them offered none. Imagine walking into the forge at dawn. The fire must be stirred to life again, the bellows pushed until sparks rise. The hammer waits on the anvil exactly where it rested the night before. There are no surprises here, only work that continues without pause. For some, that sameness would feel suffocating, but for the smith, it became the boundary lines of existence. Those repeating motions were not meaningless, they were stability. The blow of a hammer was not only striking iron, it was marking time, a sequence as regular as breath or heartbeat. In this way, the forge did not only wear down the body, it also created a form of ritual, and within that ritual, the smith found ground to stand on. But ritual has two faces. On darker days, it felt like a trap. The constant sameness meant years could blur into one another, each indistinguishable from the last. Standing in smoke, hearing the hiss of quenched iron, seeing sparks leap at the same angle, a man could wonder if his entire life had narrowed into one unchanging loop. The risk of despair was real. To survive the sameness, mental strategies grew as necessary as physical strength. Tools became companions, extensions of the body. A hammer was not just iron on wood, but almost another limb, something so constant it was given personality, weight, and meaning. An anvil, scarred by years of strikes, might be imagined as a partner that bore witness to creation and suffering alike. Some blacksmiths found pride in perfection. Even if a hinge looked like the 1,000 others made before it, they could take a moment to note its clean lines, its strong hold, its practical beauty. It was not a masterpiece meant for kings, but it was flawless in its purpose, and for a man surrounded by repetition, that quiet pride acted like a shield against apathy. By focusing not only on what was done but how it was done, the smith built value in what most others saw as routine. His world shrank to small victories, but those victories mattered because they kept the mind anchored. Without that pride, the hammer turned into nothing but a punishment, an endless task with no satisfaction attached. Others surrendered themselves fully as though the forge was not work but a kind of lifelong prayer. The movements became ritual chants, silent and physical rather than spoken. The bellows moved with rhythm like choral breaths, while the hammer fell with the beat of a drum against iron. It became less about progress and more about devotion, repeating until repetition itself carried purpose. Like a monk in a cloister repeating psalms, the smith repeated blows not as endless drudgery, but as a way of aligning himself with something larger. Even in suffering, there was a measure of meditation, because each stroke was both ending and beginning, destroying shape and creating it anew. That duality formed one of the strangest parts of the blacksmith's mental world. Every blow was destruction of what came before, bending or breaking the metal that once existed. Yet every blow was also creation, reshaping raw matter into something useful. It was a strange form of meditation born entirely out of toil. Where others sought enlightenment through silence, the smith found it in noise. On some level, his fire and hammer mirrored the human condition itself. Old forms must be broken to make new life possible. It was a philosophy carved not into books, but into muscle memory. Though his work connected him to every villager, mentally he remained isolated. The forge stood often at the edge of settlement. The man inside appeared visible to all, yet lived apart. Villagers visited when they needed something and then left, leaving the smith in the echo of his tools. Daily life for him existed on the boundary between public and private. He was ever present, but rarely truly part of social life. While others gathered in fields or markets, his world remained firelight, clang, and smoke. That isolation pressed on him as heavily as the weight of iron. He lived among people yet apart, his closest relationships often with metal itself. This separation made him both important and strange in the eyes of his neighbors. A farmer might rely on his hands, yet hesitate to be close to him. The constant smoke marked him as different, almost untouchable, as though he carried another element about him. And in subtle ways that difference bred superstition. Fire was not seen as neutral. It carried danger, purification, and transformation. To work daily with it seemed mystical, even threatening. Some whispered unease around smiths, imagining them linked with powers beyond normal life. They turned raw stone into tools, iron into weapons, shaping matter against its natural state. Few could watch such transformation without seeing something uncanny. For the smith, this superstition created an even stranger mental balance. He was needed, yet feared. Villagers respected him, but often with distance, as though his forge marked him apart from ordinary men. Standing in fire, drawing shapes from glowing matter, he was both craftsman and figure of suspicion. That knowledge weighed on the mind as keenly as physical burdens. He both belonged to the community and remained outside it, balancing usefulness with unease and learning to live within that contradiction. In this way, endurance was not physical alone. Survival required reshaping the inner self until routine became meaning, until isolation became ritual, until fear transformed into reverence. It was psychological alchemy of the highest kind, turning endless toil into a kind of faith. No creed was spoken out loud, but each blow carried belief. Belief in the value of labor, in the necessity of his role, in the strange sacredness of fire and iron. His body endured because his mind reshaped suffering into rhythm, his own kind of devotion performed not in silence, but in sparks. And this mental world did not stand separate from the larger systems of labor. His endurance connected directly into the web of survival that marked the Middle Ages. The unseen foundation of society rested on smiths who carried burdens quietly, both in body and in mind. Their fire was not a lonely flicker, but a link in the chain that bound together peasants' work, lords' power, and the fragile continuity of life itself. Why do we rarely hear about blacksmiths despite their fingerprints resting on every tool of the age? Castles rise in stories, battlefields echo with songs of knights, and manuscripts immortalize the words of priests. But the men who shaped the metal behind all of it remain curiously absent. They existed behind the scenes, hidden in smoke-filled workshops, their presence recorded not in words, but in heat, sound, and iron. Their names faded, even as their work held entire societies together. When we imagine the Middle Ages, it is easy to picture banners waving on castles, or nobles dressed in armor walking proudly through stone courtyards. The stage of history seems crowded with kings proclaiming authority, merchants counting coins, and bishops raising their hands in judgment. Yet all those figures held objects that bound their power to reality. The crowns sat encircled by metal shaped to fit the head of authority. Monks who copied texts closed those books with hinges crafted to endure repeated handling. Merchants measured goods with balances built in smithies. Underneath all that ceremony and wealth, a blacksmith's hand left silent evidence. Consider the knight, celebrated endlessly in epic tales. His grandeur owed nothing without the blade he carried. That sword was not born in a royal hall. It was hammered in heat, the product of a rhythm measured not by drums or trumpets, but by sweat and strain from the edge of town. A single knight might represent honor on the battlefield, but behind him stood hours of hammer strokes, each folding and shaping the steel. Without that, he was simply a man in cloth. Farmers too owed their survival to the forge. A plough without a hardened share tore shallow lines in soil, wasting seed and work. But a sharp, well-kept blade dug deep, turning the ground into fertile promise. It was not seasonal luck alone that kept villages alive. It was the unseen precision of iron crafted by someone who rarely received thanks. Even the church sword on iron, the largest bells which marked the rhythm of time and celebration, could not exist without smelting, pouring, and shaping by those skilled in metal. Smaller objects, the locks for treasury chests, the hinges on sacred doors, the holders for candles, each came from blackened hands. Faith carried its weight through materials as much as sermons. A parish might forget the smith who had cast its bell, but the tolling rang out daily, a constant call preserved by his anonymous labor. Households felt this hidden reliance most closely. Every door opened only because hinges endured strain again and again. Every chain, hook, latch, pot, and pan depended on smithing. The average family might see their blacksmith weekly or more. To them, he was a figure covered in soot, always engaged in fire. But his importance went unnoticed, beyond immediate need. When they sat to dinner, their knives were silent testaments to his work. When they traveled, iron-shod carts rolled on wheels held fast by bands he had hammered into place. Yet when stories were told by firesides, he received no recognition, as though his role was obvious enough not to require acknowledgement. And what makes this absence more striking is the contrast between the silence of written history and the relentless noise of his craft. The forge was never quiet. It roared with the bellows, hissed with quenching water, and rang sharp with every hammer strike. Anyone living nearby would have carried those sounds in their ears as much as the chanting of priests or the bells of churches. The blacksmith's song was the rhythm of the universe around them, louder in fact than many other human activities. Yet, on parchment, his voice is almost still. Documents wrote of lords, lands, wars, and miracles. The smith seldom merited a line. History chose to record who wore the sword, not who made it. This silence says much about how we assign glory. A knight might swing steel valiantly, praised for skill and bravery, yet his weapon demanded weeks of unseen toil. A farmer might feed the village, yet his success rested on tools that would snap without care each winter. A church might inspire awe, but even its bells needed a craftsman's fire. The infrastructure of survival was a system of repetition, sweat, and endurance. It powered men who claimed status even as the one who made it possible stood removed. The relationship reveals an uncomfortable truth. Civilization reserves its memory for spectacle, letting the foundation vanish into obscurity. Imagine if we reversed the perspective for a moment. What if every chronicle began not with the announcement of a battle or a birth of a ruler, but with the simple daily report? The smith lit the forge. The smith hammered the iron. The smith closed the day. Suddenly the grandeur of medieval Europe would look different. We would recognize that before soldiers marched, before kings gave commands, before farmers planted seed, a blacksmith's day had already set the stage. Yet because pen and ink were in clerical hands, the clang of iron faded unheard, left behind in unspeaking dust. The endurance of blacksmiths, therefore, is not a small side story to medieval life. It forms the ground upon which everything else was built. Their workshops crafted continuity across centuries, their invisible work stretching into every layer of society. Wars expanded because blades existed. Towns grew because wagons ran. Churches influenced souls because their bells rang. This quiet persistence did not craft glory, but it created possibility. The smiths became the hidden gears turning beneath the weight of empires, their iron loud in villages yet silent on parchment. It is worth recognizing what kind of endurance this demanded. Day after day, year after year, blacksmiths returned to unchanging forges while the outside world recorded dramatic upheavals and shifting crowns. Regimes rose and fell, but the hammering continued. Villages burned, but when rebuilt, iron fastened the beams once more. Even in famine, someone still required nails to mend a wagon or hinges for a door. The constancy of smithing tied humanity's survival across upheaval. It created the unseen thread between collapse and restoration. The medieval world quite literally moved forward only because blacksmiths kept hammering. Without them, carts stopped, tools failed, and weapons disintegrated. They were engines hidden in plain sight, pushing society without sharing in its recognition. Their endurance does not fit into tales of knights or kings, but it was the heartbeat that allowed such figures to exist at all. Civilization flowed from smoke-filled rooms where nameless figures stood bent over red-hot metal, pressing iron into forms that carried life. And what makes their place all the more human is that they continued despite neglect. Despite failing lungs, bent backs, and meager rewards, they persisted. They did not work for glory. They worked because society would collapse without their hands. Theirs is perhaps the truest endurance story of the medieval age, a labor both indispensable and invisible, hammering into silence the shape of an entire world. It leads us naturally toward a larger reflection. If blacksmiths, loud, essential, everywhere, were allowed to fade into obscurity, what does that say of the many other hidden labors that carried civilization through the centuries? Their story is not just about iron, smoke, or toil. It is about the unrecognized endurance that kept humanity alive. Survival in the medieval forge was never simply a trade, it was a ritual sacrifice. Each strike of the hammer cost flesh and breath, traded away so the village could keep moving forward. What seemed like ordinary work was, in truth, the gradual surrender of body and mind to fire that never rested. Society framed its greatness on kings and warriors, yet their strength rested on men whose names dissolved in smoke, who labored until their own strength broke. When history forgets those who kept everything running, what other hidden labors, quiet, uncelebrated, but vital, have we allowed to slip away unnoticed?